Hi, good morning, America. How are you? It's a new day in America, and I'm feeling very grateful. My parents are getting the vaccine today, please God, and yeah, feeling grateful. So let's say a blessing. Let's thank God for the world that we live in, for the power of healing, for the wonder of modern medicine, and on top of all that, we have this this Torah that we get to busy ourselves with. So let's say a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to start with a textual question. We're going to start with a parshanut question. We're going to like hang it in the air, and then we're going to leave it and come back to it, or loop back to it at the end. Okay, if you saw our topic for the day, if you saw any of the postings, which is the firstborn, the concept of the firstborn. We're going to spend most of our time just trying to process that concept. But let's just begin with the way that most Torah inquiries begin, which is with a textual question. Okay, so Carrie, can I ask you to post the source sheet in the chat there? Here's our textual question. What happens is we find at the end of our parsha is Parshat Bo, and that's it. It's the beginning of the Exodus. We are beginning to leave Egypt. Like this is really happening, and it includes the last few plagues, right? And then the sort of the announcement of the Passover rituals, and then they head out. That's it. That's it. We like left. It's great. So that should be like, that should be the main action, and that should be like the tada at the end of the parsha. But instead, the parsha ends in kind of a funny way. The last aliyah, the last chapter in the parsha, is chapter 13, and I'll just show you the way that chapter 12 moves into chapter 13. And you'll see that there's something kind of just shocking, or not shocking, but a little like rhythmically surprising about the introduction of chapter 13 here. So chapter 12 ends, and here it is. It's like a summation of the Exodus. Chapter 12 ends that very day. That very day, the Eternal freed the children of Egypt Israel from the land of Egypt, troop by troop. Okay, ta-da! And then chapter 13 begins. So you can see like number 1 here, chapter 13 begins. And all of a sudden, the Eternal spoke to Moses saying, consecrate to me every firstborn, man and beast, the first issue of every womb among the Israelites is mine. Okay? Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, kadesh li kol bechor. This is the word for firstborn, and this is the word that we're going to be spending a lot of our time on today, bechor. Peter kol rechem, the issue of every womb. Bivnei Yisrael, among the children of Israel. Ba'adam, among human beings. Uva behema, and among animals. Lihu, they are mine. Okay, so here's the textual question is really why are we talking about this now? What's this strange, in the middle of the greatest kind of uprising in history, all of a sudden it's like, one thing I wanted to tell you, which is that you're going to now have to, every firstborn and also animals, they're going to belong to me. So why that now? Why are we hearing? And some of you probably have a sense this isn't just rhetoric. It becomes a real practice. This idea of, indeed, we're gonna dig into it further, but this it becomes a mitzvah to take the first of your animals and to redeem the first of your sons to the priest. There we have you probably some of you heard of the ritual Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn. So that's where it comes from. This. But what is going on here? So let's just take a few minutes just to try. I'm curious if anyone has just an interpretation, a quick read of that jump, and what's going on here? Why are we hearing? Why the jump to this ritual, and why the idea that all of the firstborns now belong to me, Lihu? All right, let's start with Noah and Randy. Noah, please.
Yeah, my first thoughts on it are that first, it's acting as a sort of foreshadowing that the firstborn will be really important later on, and that among the Israelites, Jews, however you want to say, the firstborn are God's until they're redeemed, like you said, with the Pidyon Haben and the other rituals. But I think further that it's saying that these eldest, they're the ones that will sort of be the most important, that eventually get the inheritance and so forth.
Okay, great. So part of what happens here, yes, there's a kind of, yes, there's a drama here going on where God is claiming something in the midst of all this and seems to be related to all this. But also, Noah says, this sets up what is going to be a hallmark institution, which is the idea of the firstborn. That's an idea. And the idea of the firstborn in the ancient Israelite society and in ancient societies is that the firstborn was the inheritor. And sometimes that could mean everything, but in our tradition, it was a double portion, right? If there were three kids, three sons, right? Because daughters would presumably be married into other families. Sons would inherit the wealth, but it would be divided not 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, but the first son receives a double portion, right? So a full half, and the other two would have fourth, right? Is the way that one would work. Okay, so this maybe kind of is a little teaser of that. It sets that institution up. It acknowledges that institution. Okay, Randy, did I see you with a hand up?
Yeah, thanks, Rabbi. So that's really interesting to me that Noah was talking about looking at the future, because my glass sort of goes to the direct past. And on first hearing it, you might think it's very cynical, but to me, this is God saying, okay, you've all just been freed, but you're really not. Some of you are going to remain, their ownership will continue, but it's going to be my ownership. Mm-hmm. So I will own the firstborn of everybody, okay, of animals and humans.
Right, good. That's good. I mean, there's something here. God is clearly saying that because of what's happening, and because of what I'm doing for you, I make a claim upon you. And the way Randy puts it, you go from a human master to I'm your master now. And this is a declaration of that, but I am, because I'm saving you from this. I'm saving you from this, and in that sense, and it sounds like, I think Randy is saying, it sounds like this is a tribute. This is a way of paying God for redeeming us. It's a little Rumpelstiltskin God, right? But it's true. God takes a little bit of because God did, so God gets, right? There's an exchange there. All right. Let's maybe just take one more, and then we're gonna go back and do some diving, some swimming around. Wendy, what do you think?
I think this is connected to everything that we read in liturgy. God, remember me, I'm the one who took you out of Egypt. And this is something that is continuing physically to remind us every time the first child, every first thing is dedicated to God. This is our physical reminder of that, as well as, I think, the notion that it's first God was here first. God is what brought us here. This is how we are here in the first place. This is the cause to our reason to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Wendy is doing something that the rabbis of the Talmud do, which is to turn firstness into a concept. And there are lots of firsts, right? There are lots of Reshit Kol Bachor, the first of your fruits, the first of your cattle, the first represents, and then Israel becomes the first among nations, the chosen nation, right? There's some through line for the rabbis of like the choicest, the first thing.
And just also as a part of that, if I can interject, the Shehechianu, here's this is something that we commemorate. The first time that we come to something, we stop, we pause, and really take in that what is happening, the first being.
Okay, all right, good. So we have some we've been given some very helpful conceptual frameworks for thinking about why the introduction of this concept, why now? But there's a much more straightforward answer, right? There's a much more, Susan wants to give it. Susan, what is this much more straightforward answer?
Well, all the firstborn Egyptians were killed, and this is the Jewish ones that aren't going to be killed.
That is correct. Right? The obvious answer is there was a big deal. The firstborn is not just a random thing in this story. That was the 10th plague. That was the 10th plague. God killed the firstborn of the Egyptians. I think I have it here on the source sheet. Let's just take a look. But that was the firstborn plague. Here it is announced, thus says the Eternal, toward midnight I will go forth among the Egyptians, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn of the slave girl who's behind the millstone, and all the firstborn of the cattle.
Yeah.
Right? So there it is. That's the reason. God's making a claim. Yes, God's making a claim, but God's making a claim because God killed their firstborn, and there's some connection. You, Susan, you want to speak the rest of that out?
We have to remember that that's a great pain, and so we honor our firstborn as that memory.
Great. Okay. All right. Great. Now I want to I have to put the brakes on this now. That's a kind of a teaser, and we'll circle back around to this. We did good work there, and I could, I can feel us wanting now to really think about what is going on there. What is that exchange between the killing of their firstborn, and was that a good thing? And how are we supposed to feel about that? Susan is pointing us in all of those directions, and we'll get back there. But now I want to pause and ask, in some ways, a primary question, which is, why is the firstborn such a big deal here in Exodus in this way? The whole concept of the firstborn, why is it so present here in Exodus? Because it is a big deal here, but, and this is in some ways the bigger question I have, it's a big deal here. It was a bigger deal in the book of Genesis, right? It's like suddenly we're in this new firstborn discussion where they were killed, and now we're going to give our firstborn. And the firstborn, as Wendy says, becomes this new, this sacred thing. As Noah said, will become an institution of inheritance. But the firstborn, I think it's fair to say, was actually an even bigger deal in the book of Genesis, but in a totally different way. Right? What is the firstborn issue in Genesis? It's not the firstborn getting killed and us paying back. What's the big, does someone want to speak out? What's the big firstborn issue in Genesis? Someone who hasn't spoken yet. I think Matt Silberstein's got some wisdom for it.
Yeah, this was it. You can say the whole point of Genesis is supplanting the firstborn. That from the get-go, we are saying this one's first, they're gone. Yeah. Cain and Abel's gone. Every single time, even, and I say even because of the way the Torah treats women, even firstborn sisters, we play with, God is doing this now because he's done the complete opposite for the whole book. Isn't Aaron the firstborn, the older brother?
Yes.
Yeah, even Aaron is the firstborn. So all of a sudden,
supplanted by Moses, so to
the
speak.
one supplanted by Moses. So it's like, yeah, firstborns are important, and we replace them, and oh, wait a second, we're not replacing them, or are we actually replacing the firstborn with the second because God gets the firstborn?
Okay, beautiful, excellent, Matt. Beautifully put. Also so perfectly put. That there is. Okay, first of all, Matt identifies what is one of actually the primary themes in Genesis. Matt said it's sort of like what the whole book is about, which is such a weird thing. But you might say that if you had to pick what is the number one theme in the book of Genesis, you might actually say that the through line is this question of firstborns being supplanted, undermined, replaced by someone who's not the firstborn. Okay, now that's a weird thing. And the book of Genesis is very particular about it. And then Matt's already like way ahead of us, because then Matt is starting to wonder where I want us to go eventually, which is to say, wait, now does that mean that the firstborn in Exodus is a kind of inversion of the inversion? It's a back to the original firstborn? But hold on, we're not there yet. Let's just take a second to remind ourselves of how pronounced it is in the book of Genesis and how strange it is. And the first place to look, as Matt also alluded to, is in the story of Cain and Abel, where and by saying that the firstborn is undermined in the story of Cain and Abel, we are saying that God did the undermining, right? So it's not just bad parenting here. It's God somehow, the Torah somehow wants this to be true. So, all right, first of all, this is the verb root that we're going to be following. I think if you've studied with me before, you know that one of the primary tools that I believe that we use in the study of Torah is roots, 3-letter roots. All Hebrew words, or most Hebrew words, have a 3-letter root. So this is the one we're going to be following, which means choice or elect or firstborn. Okay, and here is the first use of it in the Torah in the Cain and Abel story. In the course of time, Cain's the older one. Cain brought an offering to the Eternal from the fruit of the soil. That was Cain's idea. But then Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstlings of his flock. The Eternal paid heed to Abel and his offering, but paid no heed to Cain and his offering. Cain was much distressed and his face fell, and then Cain goes ahead and kills Abel. This ends in disaster. And it does because God favored Abel above Cain. And note that the Torah, in describing Abel's choicest firstlings, uses this root word, the Bechor, the firstborn of his sheep. So there's a little bit of a wink there at this word, which will become so important. And what gets established here then? Well, the firstborn is actually supplanted by the younger. Okay, some parent figure, though it's God in this case, some authority figure, chooses the younger instead of the older. God seems to want that, or be doing it. And then because of that, there's strife. There's conflict. The children end up embattled because the parents are, right? And this continues all the way through the book of Genesis, right? Like most prominently in Parshat Toldot with Jacob and Esav. And there's a lot of beautiful wordplay because this word Bechor is also like the same letters as the word for blessing, bracha. So they're these two brothers who are now twins. And this makes it even more pronounced because they're really not the firstborn. That's part of the issue in the twins narrative that is Jacob really the younger son? I mean, by a few seconds. By a few seconds. And that's why, that's part of what Genesis is doing. Genesis is saying, look, it's not, I think Matt was saying this, and I'll say it anyway, that Genesis seems to be saying it's not, well, what is Genesis saying? What is Genesis saying? Why is it such a big deal to the book of Genesis that the firstborn not be the one to inherit, in this case, not more property, but the covenant of God? And I'll give you one more expression of that, and then I want to hear you answer. Why is this such a big deal in the book of Genesis? But take a look at the figure who is most insistent on this firstborn trouble is Jacob. Jacob, who becomes the firstborn. He's one of those twins, and then that causes tremendous strife between him and his brother Esav, and nevertheless he favors his younger son Joseph, and that causes strife between the brothers, and they go through years of agony because of this favoritism. And nevertheless, at the end of Jacob's life, Joseph, the favored younger son, takes his children to get a blessing from their grandfather. And look at this. Joseph took the two of them, Ephraim with his right hand to Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand to Israel's right, and brought them close to him. But Israel, right, so these are his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh's the older son. And Joseph arranges them so that the first blessing will go to Manasseh. But Israel stretched out his right hand, the hand of blessing, and laid it on Ephraim's head, though he was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, thus crossing his hands. Let me just show you this, what he did here. Okay. He's like this, right? Joseph arranges the children so that the right hand, the Bechor blessing, should go on Manasseh, and Jacob goes, no, and switches it. And Joseph protests and says, haven't we learned from all the agony of this entire book that this only causes trouble? When Joseph saw that his father was placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he thought it was wrong. So he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's. Not so, father, Joseph said to his father, for the other is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head. But his father objected, saying, I know, my son, I know. Yadati b'ni yadati, it's emphasized. He too shall become a people, and he too shall be great, yet his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall be plentiful enough for nations. Look at this phrase. Ve'ulam achiv hakaton yigdal. This is Jacob's life philosophy right there. Hakaton yigdal. The small will become great. And that, if Jacob is the representative of the firstborn philosophy in the book of Genesis, I now want to ask you, what is that philosophy? Why is all of this? No, the younger, almost obsessively so. Okay, Pam Dorman. Can I invite you into this conversation?
Yes, thank you. So I think of both Breshit and Shemot as our learning about relationships and God wanting a relationship with people. And prior to Judaism, the other cultures valued the firstborn. So this is bulking against that notion that the firstborn inherits everything, whatever. So it's challenging that.
And Pam,
I think
why?
God is, Why is it
challenging that? I think you're right that this is an institution, not just Jewish, it's in ancient society, firstborn, like the inheritor. And this is, why are we challenging that, do you think, Pam?
I think differentiate Jewish practice from the other cultures. But I said, because of relationships, God has a difficult time establishing a relationship with people, doesn't work with Adam and Eve. And this is not me. I got this years ago from reading Michael Wishegrad.
Yeah.
So, right, it doesn't work with Abraham. It's all the way until you've got 12 tribes, and now you've got, people to deal with. But
either God's hard to work with, or we're hard to work with, or both, right?
But not working in relationship. But the two words you pulled out about Katan, that the younger will be greater. I'm wondering if Christianity pulls that out, because they
yes.
that's the
Yes,
word about
the answer is yes, but we
right,
won't be treating of that theology today.
Right,
okay, so let's just continue to consider this idea that this ancient institution has been supplanted, and I think Pam's exactly right. I think it does undermine a traditional structure, and part of the reason is to say we are Jews. We follow a different path. The question is, why do we follow a different path? What is it about privileging the younger, or at least opening the possibility to the younger, that is so important to us, the Torah, Judaism, God, whatever? Lila, do you have thoughts on this? Can't hear you yet.
Sorry. Hi. I'm not totally sure I'm responding to this, but I might be. It seems, I hadn't thought of this before, but that phrase also that you're offering us, I think there's some investment in like an underdog identity here. Like, so we're like a fledgling people, and this is the first half of our story, like when we're becoming, and so we need to, and it plays out in these kind of family dramas. So like this, it's not the firstborn, but it's like, it's the underdog, it's the small becoming great. And then at this juncture in our history, like there's a different messaging here. It's like, I'm not totally sure what it is with the belonging to God, but it's like, there's might here now, there's power. We're leaving this identity behind, and we're kind of like cultivating a different personality, maybe. Like phase 2 of becoming a people. We don't have to be the underdog anymore, maybe.
Yeah, okay, great. That's really interesting what you're doing, Lila, because I think it is really helpful to, as Lila is doing, to think about the context here. Like, why is it important for a family struggling to inherit God's blessing, struggling to just survive in the world, struggling to stay together? Why is it important for a family to consider the underdog? And I think Lila, part of what Lila's suggesting is, like, in Genesis, they are the underdog. They are like, they're just a fledgling, like, the tribe of Israel is a younger, smaller, weaker, but yet will ascend to greatness tribe, isn't it? Right? And maybe once we actually ascend to a national status, then it's like, well, we need a system like everyone else. Or maybe again, Lila suggests sort of symbolically, no, now we are firstborn. Like, we've ascended to the place where we would call ourselves God's firstborn, right? So thinking about like what's going on in these two books, what's happening in these two books. Jen, what do you think?
I'm wondering if there's a distinction though between giving the first of your fruits or the firstborn to God and the firstborn getting a blessing versus the younger getting a blessing, because already in the Cain and Abel story, you're supposed to give the first fruits. You're supposed to give the first of your flock. So that distinction's already there. So I feel like I can't really understand where this is going unless I know what God means by your firstborn or mine, versus whether the blessing is actually like, are those things in the same category? Is that really the same kind of thing? Is it a reversal, or is it just a different action?
Okay, that's a beautiful connection that you just made, Jen. Really beautiful connection. I just gave you the first use of Bechor, firstborn, and it turns out it's not a reference to the firstborn, it's a reference to the firstborn of the flock that Abel was offering up. In other words, there's some, actually, Jen notices the first use of firstbornness is about giving tribute to God. So if we're circling back around to that now, maybe actually it isn't just a new paradigm. It's actually, there's something entangled here that like the firstborn receives a status, but it's a status that should be ultimately offered back to God or up to God, or at least acknowledged, and God should be thanked for that status somehow. Okay, now we're beginning to get somewhere. So I want to take us back. It's about time we go back and take a look at the institution. Jen's linking takes us back there. But before we do, I want to summarize, or at least give a little further language to one of the themes that we've articulated so far, which is the idea that the firstborn in the book of Genesis is undermined in order to, and people have said this in different ways, but I want to give it my own language, in order to say that it's not about just being born first. It's about being the right person to inherit. That's the point. Isn't just to undermine the system or just to be different from other nations, though it is. It has an ethical purpose, which is to say, first of all, the thing that's being inherited is not necessarily just the father's property, but God's blessing. And that's a big deal. That's the obvious. But more than that, we have, like, when you're talking about the movement of a blessing from one generation to another, it's not a question of who came out of the womb first, right? That's an old way of thinking about it. It's a question of who's the right person to become the next Rabbi, right? Like, who's the right person to take on the mantle of this sort of spiritual tribe mission, etc. Right? And for any history, sociology buffs out there, I want to just throw out that this parallels a very famous historical theory, Henry Sumner Main's great sort of statement that all progressive societies, he says, that the movement from ancient society into modern society is a movement from status to contract. Okay, think of that as just a footnote. I don't want to like dwell on it, but his point is, in ancient societies, you're sort of born into a certain status. You inherit just based on who you are, where you are in the birth order. And there's a movement as societies become more sophisticated towards a greater, like everybody having their own individual value and being able to kind of negotiate for themselves in the world. Here, I'm actually going to give you I'll give you the original essay, just so in case you're interested. Here, put it in the chat. This is totally a tangent, but it's okay. I think it's an interesting one because it's remarkable to me. Here it is. How Maine here describes something that I think the book of Genesis is doing thousands of years earlier, which is saying that it shouldn't be. Here he is. We may say that the movement of the progressive societies has hitherto been a movement from status to contract. And if you change the word contract to brit, covenant, then it's almost a similar formulation. Okay, so a little bit of a tangent, but one that I find intellectually exciting. But let's just put a punctuation, some kind of, not period, but semicolon or something, on our discussion so far. And we have thought about the role of the firstborn in the book of Genesis, and it has meant various things to our, given our various interpretations. But it's clear that one thing it is that it's about the younger ascending and not necessarily the older. Okay, so now we return to our opening question. Now, informed by the book of Genesis, we have to ask the question that Matt was already asking at the outset, which is, wait, so what's happening here? Because this is a different structure. Now the firstborn, and Lila was describing this as well, now the firstborn is an exalted status. The firstborn has been, and it's the firstborn. Who died in the 10th plague? The firstborn. Who will you have to give to God? The firstborn. It's the first issue of the womb. The very thing we were undermining. And it's no longer about receiving God's blessing. It's about like handing yourself over to God, or handing your child over to God, or handing your, okay. So So let's take a look again at what's happening in our chapter. I'm wondering if it's worth opening it up a little bit now. Yeah, let's open it up a little bit. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but we're going to head back. We're going to read that text again. But you have the setup, so I'd love to hear. Are there those out there who'd like to begin to interpret and speculate on that flip, that movement from the firstborn in the book of Genesis to the firstborn as it plays out in the book of Exodus? The other folks wanna? Yael?
Well, something that's jumping out at me is I think we got it wrong regarding the firstborn and the first fruits being donated to God in the form of sacrifice. I don't think that's what it's about. I think that it's about service, not sacrifice. So that if the firstborn, the first issue of the womb, even of the animals and of the fruits and of the people, went to service to God instead of slaughter and sacrifice, that would have taken on a whole different picture for the future and for the infrastructure and the future and the spiritual future of the society.
Mm-hmm. Right. So part of what you're saying sounds to me, Yael, is that this is this new mechanism is a mechanism of the firstborn supporting the society, right? Being either an actual, like going to work in the temple. And by the way, if you look at other ancient societies, you'll see this come up again and again. The first being the belonging to the church, the first being in service of the greater, and it is the great representative of the family, but now the representation is towards God. You go and you appease God, or you affirm the religious institution so that your society can flourish in spiritual abundance. I'm realizing now, and I'm going to continue hearing interpretations. I think it's worth going back and let's read the text again and get some more information, because we should have all of the actual material in front of us as we begin to process what is this. We're back to our first question. What's this jump at the end of Parshat Bo to make sure that we know that we're supposed to offer the first of our sons and the first of our animals? So here it is. We're going back now, chapter 13. The Eternal spoke further to Moses, saying, Kadesh li kol b'chor peter kol rechem b'bnei Yisrael ba'adam u've'ema lihu. Consecrate to me every firstborn, man and beast, among the first issue of every womb among the Israelites is mine. Okay? Now, the book of Exodus jumps around a lot. So then, we go back here and we're talking about Passover. It's a very, we could spend our time thinking about just the movement of the whole narrative, but we won't today. I'm just jumping down here to, it's a little bit of we mention it and then we go to a different topic, and then we come back in verse 11 and here we explain it. So this will give us more to chew on here. And when the Eternal has brought you into, it's my least favorite aspect of Safari. When the Eternal has brought you into the land of the Canaanites, as God swore to you and your fathers and has given it to you, you shall set apart for the Eternal every first issue of the womb. Every male firstling that your cattle drop shall be the Eternal's. Every firstling donkey you shall redeem with a sheep. If you do not redeem it, you must break its neck. And you must redeem every firstborn male among your children. Okay, those are the things you have to do. All the cattle go to God, sacrifice to God. All the donkey, you have to purchase it. Even though it's yours, you purchase it. And then that money goes to God. And so too with the firstborn males, you pay a tribute. You redeem them. You have to pay a tribute to God for your firstborn. And then there's a little bit of explanation, and this will be really valuable to us. And when in time to come your child asks you, saying, what does this mean? Because the child, like us, is a little confused. You shall say to him, it was with a mighty hand that the Eternal brought us out from Egypt, the house of bondage. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Eternal slew every firstborn in the land of Egypt, the firstborn of both man and beast. Therefore, I sacrifice to the Eternal every first male issue of the womb, but redeem every firstborn among my sons. Okay, so some of the language is pretty explicit. Why did it happen? Because I killed their firstborn, and you saved me, and that was part of the saving me from Egypt. So I get your firstborn. Okay, now we got like a lot of material. So now you know what happens. So again, the question we're asking is, why is the firstborn serving as this way now in the book of Exodus? All right, who wants to jump in? Yonatan has had his hand up for a while.
Yeah, I think that the major function of the firstborn in these cases has to do with attachment. That we get more attached to the firstborn. That maybe not. I mean, in modernity, this is an idea that kind of seems weird to us, but used to be very commonly accepted, and that's true for produce also, and the cows and everything, and so on. And we also get the idea sometimes that, you know, the firstborn deserves everything, right? So this is, I think, falls into the broader pattern that the Torah gives us, that we don't actually own anything. We don't get to be attached to anything, that God dictates those terms for us. And lest we think that God gave us freedom in Egypt to do as we please, God says, no. Remember, you don't own this. Your freedom does not belong to you. Your freedom belongs to me. And for you to remember that, you need to give me your firstborn.
Ooh, I love that. This is, I think, a brilliant interpretation that Yonatan's just offered us, because it does this incredible trick of resolving what seems to us to be contradictory models for the firstborn. And I think, if I understand you correctly, Yonatan, there's a through line between them, because Yonatan is saying there's this natural human tendency that you're like, you know, that's my first. Nothing like, you know, you're first, as the old saying goes. But like, you're first, like, it's natural in a way for a parent to love their firstborn child, maybe the most. And you have to push back against that, right? On a psychological, familial level, you have to push back against that. And Genesis is there to say, lose that instinct, because you'll end up loving one child more than another child. That's not good. So, you know that all of your children could be the inheritors, right? Like, let go of that connection that you have. That's that unreasonable connection you have to the first. And then I think Yonatan's interpretation moves nicely into the same sort of formulation in the book of Exodus, which is, again, you're attached, you have this natural, like, oh, the first issue of this litter, and my first child, and my first this, and it's all mine, my first, I love my first, and you have to let go of that too. And you give the first thing you get that you really, nope, you give that up to God. So it's about letting go of this idea that it's like you have this unnatural, not unnatural, but sort of unreasonable and maybe unfair attachment to the thing that you got first, to your first dollar on the wall. You know what I mean? So I love that. Did I see Michael Becker just raise his hand?
Sure. Playing on the first dollar on the wall thing, right? Like, part of the reason with pride you hang the first dollar on the wall is because you think you did that, right? Like, it was my hard work that meant that I got the first, right? Like, I'm just building on Yonatan's audience because this is his idea. I'm just building on, right? But yeah. when you know, Yehoshua and troops conquer Jericho, because that's the first city in Israel they conquer, so all the spoils of that war go to God. That's a reminder that you know, this isn't because Israel actually is the best army, but because God is on their side and making them win. When you give the first of your crops, yes, it's delayed gratification, and yes, it's not being overly attached to something, but it's also the humility of, oh wait, I didn't do this, right? I got this because God, on some level, I mean, my hard work, but God made it possible, And so it's not that Shemot is not revolutionary, right? God is just taking what belongs to God, lest just in case we start to think that it's more because of us than because of something else.
Okay, all right, good. So Michael describes it more like different paradigms, but both having spiritual import or ethical import. And I love the layering that you gave us. I don't think we've really considered that yet, that the younger child should know that it's God's blessing that moves them, that drives them. And you know, Michael's interpretation also can be used to thread through into Exodus also and say, like, it's about God's, the focus here is on God. It's like all about the economy, stupid, right? Like, it's all about God, stupid. It's like, that's the thing. It's God's blessing. It's not about who comes out first, and it's not about anything but giving to God. That might be one way of thinking about it, but I think there's a psychological lesson that Michael's describing also, where you shouldn't assume that any of your blessing in the world is because you deserved it, you earned it, you had it coming, you're better in some way. If you're blessed in the world, and maybe this is like the foundational religious message, if you're blessed in the world, give to God. If I have a lot of sheep, I give my first to God. If I become the chosen one, it's because God picked me. And I'm sorry, I'm elaborating a lot on what Michael said, but I think there's a lot here. And that, I think Michael suggests, is important for us, Israel, because we're the younger, littler, smaller nation. And so we shouldn't feel like, oh, we were chosen by God. It's so great to be chosen by God. We're the chosen people. We should feel like, whoa, we didn't deserve this. We're the tiniest nation in the world, right? And that's what that's what the book of Deuteronomy says, that it's not because you were the biggest nation in the world that God chose you. In fact, you were the smallest. Ela mi'avat Hashem. But because God loved you, favored you. Okay, so maybe we're getting to that kind of spirit as we consider the various forms of firstbornness. Okay, other theories. Who have I not heard from yet? Arlene. Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to call on Esra next, and then I'll go straight to you, Arlene. Esra.
Yeah, I'd like to raise a point and a question. I'll start with the point. The point, I'm seeing another theme here, and maybe it seems that I'm resting on this notion that perhaps God in relationship with Bnei Israel and the world shifts God's perspective as time goes on through the Torah. So in Breshit, we see one kind of approach, and maybe by the time we're getting to Exodus, we're seeing another approach. And so maybe, and I could be reading what I want to read, but this move towards equity, and it happens in some parallel ways, like, okay, before it was the youngest, and then the oldest, and then it was Bnei Israel, and then the Egyptians, and then Bnei Israel. But looking at the verbs being used, and this relates to my question, sanctified or redeemed or sacrificed. These are the words floating around in relationship to what it means to be chosen. So I guess I'm wondering, look, the Egyptians were chosen to be sacrificed, to make a point. Mm-hmm. Then the firstborn of Bnei Israel will be sacrificed, mm-hmm. sanctified, mm-hmm. redeemed. That's my question mark. Like, I'd like some differentiation on what meanings of those words have. But anyway, what I'm kind of wanting to interpret is this move towards everyone gets to be important, including the middle children that we're not really talking about. We're talking about oldest and youngest. What about the middle children? And then, everyone has a role in this universe, whether Bnei Israel or not, whether youngest or oldest or not.
Okay, great. So, yeah, it is worth thinking about whether this isn't, there's something new happening, and God is now, what the work of Genesis has been completed. There was some kind of ongoing tension in the book of Genesis that had to do with families and favoritism, but that did its work. Now the firstborn is being defined completely differently. So that we see, that we know. But and I think Esther begins to suggest, but it doesn't even feel like a firstborn. It doesn't, or at least not what the firstborn meant in the book of Genesis was, you are on top. And now firstborn is all about sacrifice, giving, and it doesn't seem to be like, is it so special to be the firstborn? And I want to make Esther's point even stronger, I think, by considering that this institution that the book of Exodus is introducing, it becomes even further diluted, so to speak, when the firstborn that you owe to God, every Israelite family, in the book of Numbers gets transferred officially to the tribe of Levi. So just take a look at this, just so you see how I think part of what I was hearing in Esther's description is the firstborn idea is almost beginning to fade away into something else, right? So take a look at in the book of Numbers how this very thing, the Eternal spoke to Moses saying, I hereby take the Levites from among the Israelites in place of all the firstborn, the first issue of the womb of the Israelites. The Levites shall be mine. And this is where you get like the Levites and the priests serving in the temple. And there's a very explicit reference to why. For every firstborn is mine. At the time that I smote every firstborn in the land of Egypt, I consecrated every firstborn in Israel, man and beast, to myself, to be mine, the Eternal's. So I think Esther is pointing us in the right direction here. Somehow the language here has shifted, and whatever it is that a firstborn is, it's about giving to God. It's about sacrificing about it. It's about God having possession of the firstborn. Now, what does that mean? And why, may I add, did God earn that by killing the firstborn of Egypt? Okay, more thoughts. Arlene. Arlene, we're not hearing you.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One, I was in the Genesis, was thinking about, like when the Jewish prayer, it's about the awe and the fear, to have fear of God. Mm-hmm. And I think it just sort of ties in because in Genesis, the plagues happen and everything like that. So we see God's glory. And so if we're given in Exodus, if we're given the firstborn to God, it's a sense of the awe and the fear going into the firstborn, but of God's power into creating a society for the Jewish people. And then you also have the sense of family and the commitment. So actually, if the sense of awe went into the firstborn, and I was thinking, what about the firstborn? What if the firstborn was, let's say God killed off the firstborn in the plagues of the Egyptians, but the Jewish people, maybe he did a special blessing for them or something like that, to say that you're, and that special blessing is going to be when you get, let's say somebody was pregnant, they have the first baby, they still have that remnant of what was in Egypt in the past, if that makes sense. And then it carries one generation to another generation when you have the Passover Seder, that you remember because you have this core belief, identity, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. So first of all, I want to just echo Arlene's basic point here, which is that I think it's a new way of putting it, and I appreciate it, Arlene, than we've heard so far, which is that maybe it is very different. And what Exodus is actually doing is almost like a literary technique, which is saying, I know that the firstborn was a great obsession of your family for generations. So we're going to harness that concept because you've already got this crazy reverence for it. We're going to use that, but now it's going to serve a different function. We're just borrowing this older form of like the firstborn is the greatest and all of your drama around it. And now it's becoming something else entirely. And that that I think I was feeling like we were running out of time, but so I wasn't going to share this last text, but Arlene's comments take us right to this last text, because Arlene describes. So what is that? What is that function? What's happening in the book of Exodus? Why is the firstborn concept being utilized in this way? And Arlene says, well, I mean, on some level, it's drawing a distinction, right? Distinction between Israel and Egypt. And actually, that is what the Torah says in the announcement of the firstborn plague. We looked at this text briefly earlier, but take a look. Hold on one sec. Get back here. Take a look at the language in the firstborn, the plague, right? We read this, the God saying that God's going to kill all the firstborn, they'll all die, it'll be such a loud cry, it's a terrible thing. And then the last sort of description of it says, but not a dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites, at man or beast, in order that you may know that the Eternal makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Asher yafle Hashem bein Mitzrayim uvein Yisrael. Okay, so that language, I think, is similar to the language that Arlene was using just now, and I think this idea of making a distinction between the Israelites and Egypt, the idea of designating the Israelites as distinct, separate, set apart, is actually what the firstborn concept is becoming in the book of Exodus. It's not about your being born into a family first. It's not even about your being born into a family second or third or youngest, or being favored by God or by your parent, right? It's about being set aside, distinguished by God. And the word that we use for being set aside, for being distinguished by God, is kadesh. And that was the very first word that we looked at when we saw the introduction of this commandment, which is kadesh li kol bachor. Consecrate to me every firstborn. That word is the word that we often translate as holy. Make holy for me every bachor. And in it, the truth is, in a way, the entire class can be summarized in just this phrase, kadesh li kol bachor. The thing that was once bachor, the inheritor who had been born first, is now the one who has been sanctified, the one who has been made holy, right? And that's why the priests are the one that take on this responsibility, because they're carrying the holiness. But the whole idea of the firstborn becomes about holiness, about God's designation, and that, because of that, you in the realm of holiness, you pay tribute to God. You make an offering to God, right? You're in this sanctified relationship with God. All right, there's so much more to do here. We could keep going, but I think we've done great work today, and I think we'll just end it there. But sufficeth to say, this concept of the firstborn, it seems like such a random concept, doesn't it? It's like that big a deal. Oh, there's my mom. I'm gonna see she got her vaccination. But the concept is one of the biggest concepts in the Torah. Right? And that's a crazy, or at least in the first two books, that's a crazy idea, right? That becomes one of the central kind of conceptual axes that we use to think through issues of fairness and justice and family and nation and holiness, right? Ultimately holiness. So, all right, my mom I think is calling me, so I gotta go. It's nice to see you all.